You know what? I've been watching WWE for over 2 decades now, and I thought I'd seen everything Roman Reigns could possibly do. I mean, the guy's been the face of the company for years, right? He's got the bloodline running roughshod over everyone, Paul Heyman whispering sweet strategic nothings in his ear, and basically, he's untouchable. But here's the thing that's been eating at me for months, and I'm talking losing sleep over this. There's something else happening, something we're not seeing. You ever get that feeling when you're watching a magic trick and you know there's more to it than what's right in front of your face? That's exactly what's happening with Roman right now. See, everyone thinks the bloodline is just about family dominance. Solo Sikoa throwing people around, the Usos with their twin magic, Roman sitting at the head of the table looking all tribal and chief-like. But that's not the whole picture, not even close. Actually, you know what's funny? I was at Starbucks the other day, and this random guy behind me in line was talking about how Roman's getting boring. And I'm thinking, dude, you have no idea what you're actually watching. None. I've been digging into this for months, analyzing match patterns, studying backstage politics, even looking at NXT call-ups and roster movements that don't make sense on the surface. And what I found? It's bigger than anyone realizes. We're not just looking at the bloodline anymore. We're looking at Shield too. And Roman Reigns isn't just the tribal chief. He's the architect of something that's going to change WWE forever. Let me tell you something that's going to blow your mind. Actually, before I get into this, did you see that thing on Twitter about how the bloodline's been trending every week for 8 months straight? That's not normal, right? But anyway, the bloodline as we know it, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Literally just the visible part of something much more sophisticated underneath. And I know this sounds conspiracy theory level crazy, but hear me out. You see, everyone's been so focused on the family aspect, the tribal combat, the respect for the head of the table, all that traditional Samoan warrior stuff, that they've completely missed what Roman's actually been doing. He's not just leading a faction. He's been systematically rebuilding the Shield's tactical blueprint, but with a level of sophistication that would make Sun Tzu proud. Think about it for a second. Actually, you know what reminds me of this? I was watching House of Cards on Netflix recently. Yeah, I know I'm 5 years behind on everything, but the way Frank Underwood manipulates everyone around him while they think they're making their own decisions, that's exactly what Roman's been doing. The original Shield wasn't just 3 guys who happened to work well together. Seth, Dean, and Roman had specific roles that created this perfect storm of chaos and control. Seth was the architect, the technical mastermind who could adapt to any situation. Dean was the wild card, the unpredictable element that kept opponents guessing. And Roman was the powerhouse, the enforcer who brought the raw strength to back up their strategic brilliance. But here's where it gets interesting, and I mean really interesting. Roman didn't just learn how to be the muscle of that operation. He was studying, actually studying. He was absorbing everything Seth did with strategic planning, everything Dean did with psychological warfare, and he was adding his own layer of political manipulation on top of it all. My buddy who works in corporate strategy, shout out to Mike if you're watching this, he always says the smartest people in any organization are the ones who learn from everyone around them while appearing to just be doing their own job. That's exactly what Roman was doing during the Shield years. Fast forward to 2024, and look at what we've got. The Bloodline isn't operating like a traditional wrestling family. They're operating like a military unit with Roman as both the commanding officer and the strategic planner. Every attack has been calculated. Every alliance has been purposeful. Every betrayal has been part of a larger design. Take the whole Sami Zayn situation, for example. Everyone thought that was about loyalty and respect, right? Sami couldn't acknowledge Roman, so he got kicked out. But think deeper about that. And this is where it gets really wild. Roman used Sami to infiltrate other storylines, to gather intelligence on potential threats, and when Sami had served his purpose, Roman manufactured the betrayal to eliminate him while simultaneously strengthening the bloodline's unity. That's not family drama. That's tactical genius. And the timing of everything? The way Solo Sikoa was brought in right when the Usos started showing signs of independence? The way Paul Heyman's role has evolved from manager to strategic advisor? None of this is accidental. Roman's been building something, and every piece has been carefully placed. Actually, speaking of timing, did you notice how all the major bloodline developments happen right when other storylines are reaching their peak? That's not coincidence. That's Roman understanding that the best time to make power moves is when everyone else is distracted by their own drama. Classic political strategy, actually. But here's what really got me thinking about all this. You remember how the Shield used to appear out of nowhere, through the crowd, from backstage, sometimes from under the ring itself? They controlled the element of surprise better than any faction in modern WWE history. Well, the Bloodline's been doing the same thing, but on a much larger scale. Look at their interference patterns over the past year. It's not just random family members showing up to help. There's been a systematic approach to when they appear, how they appear, and what they accomplish. It's like Roman's taken the Shield's hit and run tactics and applied them to long-term storytelling. And that brings us to the real kicker. Actually, you know what's crazy? I was rewatching some old Shield matches last week, and the patterns are so obvious once you know what to look for. But anyway, the Bloodline as we see it, Roman, Solo, the Usos, Paul Heyman, that's just the public face of the operation. There's a whole other layer operating in the shadows. New faces who've been carefully selected and positioned. Wrestlers who seem unconnected to the Bloodline, but who've been exhibiting Shield-like characteristics in their recent work. I've been tracking this for months, and the patterns are undeniable. Roman hasn't just been maintaining power, he's been building an empire. And the foundation of that empire isn't just Samoan family tradition. It's the Shield methodology, evolved and perfected for long-term dominance. The scary part? If I'm right about this, and everything I've seen suggests I am, then we haven't even seen the real weapon yet. The Bloodline's current configuration is just the setup. The real play, the Shield 2 reveal, that's still coming. And when it hits, it's gonna change everything we think we know about power dynamics in WWE. Okay, so here's where things get really fascinating. And I know this might sound overly analytical, but I'm kind of a nerd about this stuff. My girlfriend always jokes that I treat wrestling like it's a graduate-level political science course, but whatever. To understand what Roman's building, we need to go back and really analyze what made the Shield so devastatingly effective in the first place. Because it wasn't just about 3 talented wrestlers working together, it was about a tactical approach that revolutionized how factions operate in WWE. The original Shield had 3 core principles that made them unstoppable. Actually, you know what's interesting? I was listening to a business podcast the other day. I think it was Tim Ferriss, maybe. And they were talking about how the most successful teams always have these same 3 elements. But anyway, first was unity through shared purpose. They weren't just 3 guys who liked each other. They were 3 guys who believed they were fighting for justice, even if their version of justice was completely twisted. That shared ideology made them willing to sacrifice individual glory for collective dominance. Second was calculated chaos. Every Shield attack looked spontaneous and wild, but if you really studied their patterns, there was always a method to the madness. They'd create confusion to mask their true objectives. While everyone was focused on the immediate chaos, the Shield was accomplishing specific strategic goals. Third was strategic targeting. They didn't just attack randomly. Every victim was chosen for a specific reason, to send a message, to eliminate a threat, or to position themselves better in the larger WWE landscape. They were always thinking 3 moves ahead. Now, here's where Roman's genius becomes apparent. And this is going to sound crazy, but stick with me. He's taken these 3 principles and evolved them for the modern era, but in a way that's so subtle that most people haven't even noticed it's happening. Let's start with unity through shared purpose. The Bloodline's public narrative is all about family and respect, right? But if you dig deeper, what's really binding them together is something much more sophisticated. Romans created a shared belief system around the idea that they're not just a family, they're the rightful rulers of WWE. Every member of the Bloodline genuinely believes that Roman's success elevates all of them, and that their individual success strengthens the whole unit. But here's the kicker, and this is where it gets really interesting. Roman's been expanding this ideology beyond just his blood relatives. I've noticed wrestlers throughout the roster who've started adopting bloodline-style tactics and philosophies, even when they're not directly connected to the family. It's like Roman's been quietly evangelizing his approach to power, creating a whole network of wrestlers who think like the bloodline, even if they don't wear the family colors. Actually, you know what this reminds me of? There's this book called The 48 Laws of Power. Yeah, I know, very original reading choice for a wrestling fan. But one of the laws is about getting people to do what you want while making them think it was their idea. That's exactly what Roman's been doing. Take Solo Sikoa's development, for example. When he first showed up, everyone thought he was just another family enforcer. But watch his recent matches. The way he controls pace, the way he uses intimidation as a tactical tool, the way he positions himself in multi-person situations. That's not just natural talent. That's someone who's been specifically trained in Shield methodology. Now, let's talk about calculated chaos. And this is where it gets really wild. The Bloodline's attacks over the past year have looked like family protection instincts, but the timing and execution tell a different story. Every major Bloodline interference has accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. They protect Roman, sure, but they also send messages to specific competitors, create new storyline opportunities, and position family members for their own advancement. Remember the whole Kevin Owens situation? On the surface, it looked like family defending family. But Roman used that conflict to test Solo's loyalty, to gauge the Usos' commitment level, and to send a message to every other potential challenger about what happens when you threaten the head of the table. One storyline, multiple strategic objectives. That's Shield thinking applied to long-term faction management. Actually, speaking of KO, did you see his tweets after that whole thing went down? He was clearly frustrated, but not just about losing. He was frustrated about being outmaneuvered. That tells you something right there. And the strategic targeting? Oh man, this is where Roman's evolution becomes really obvious. The Shield used to target people for immediate tactical advantage, but Roman's been playing a much longer game. Every feud, every alliance, every betrayal has been about positioning the Bloodline for sustained dominance over years, not just months. Look at how he's handled potential threats. He didn't just beat Brock Lesnar. He systematically dismantled Brock's aura of invincibility over multiple encounters. He didn't just defeat Drew McIntyre. He used that feud to establish the Bloodline as a global force. Each victory has been designed to eliminate not just individual competitors, but entire categories of potential challengers. But here's what really convinced me that we're looking at Shield 2 rather than just successful family management. Roman's been developing contingency plans for everything. The original Shield was reactive. They'd adapt to whatever WWE threw at them. But Roman's bloodline has been proactive, creating situations rather than just responding to them. Like, you know how in chess, grandmasters aren't just thinking about their next move? They're thinking about how their current move sets up possibilities 3 or 4 moves down the line. That's exactly what Roman's been doing with storyline development. And that brings us to the most interesting part of this blueprint. Roman's not just rebuilding the Shield, he's improving it. The original version eventually collapsed because it was built around 3 strong personalities who inevitably wanted individual glory. But Roman's version is built around a hierarchy that actually strengthens over time rather than weakening. The bloodline structure allows for individual success within the collective framework. The Usos can be tag team champions, Solo can pursue his own feuds, Paul Heyman can maintain his own storylines, but everything feeds back into Roman's overall strategic vision. It's like he's created a faction that gets stronger as its members get more successful rather than weaker. Actually, you know what this reminds me of? Amazon's business model. Jeff Bezos built a company where every division's success makes the whole company stronger, rather than creating internal competition. That's exactly what Roman's done with the bloodline structure. Now, this is where things get really interesting, and I gotta admit, this is where my analysis starts getting into what my friends would probably call conspiracy theory territory. But, you know what? Sometimes the conspiracy theories turn out to be right. I've been keeping track of some wrestlers who've been flying under the radar, but who've been exhibiting characteristics that are suspiciously Shield-like. And I'm not talking about obvious connections here. I'm talking about subtle shifts in wrestling style, storyline positioning, and tactical approach that suggests Roman's influence has been spreading further than anyone realizes. Let me start with the most obvious candidate, and this one's going to surprise some people: LA Knight. Now, I know what you're thinking. LA Knight's whole persona is about individual charisma and self-promotion. But watch his recent work more carefully. Actually, you know what's funny? I was at a live show in Phoenix a couple months ago, and Knight's entrance got a huge pop. But the way he worked, the crowd was different. More strategic, I guess. The way he's been positioning himself in multi-person situations, the way he's been using psychological tactics to control opponents, even the way he's been building alliances and managing conflicts, that's not just natural charisma. That's strategic thinking that's remarkably similar to Shield methodology. Knight's been systematically establishing himself as a power player, but not in the traditional climb-the-ladder way that most wrestlers pursue championship opportunities. Instead, he's been creating situations where other wrestlers need his approval or support to advance their own careers. That's exactly the kind of long-term positioning that Roman perfected during his Shield days. But here's where it gets really intriguing. Knight's been having backstage conversations with Paul Heyman that WWE's cameras have captured but never really explained. Just brief exchanges, nothing that creates obvious storylines, but enough to establish that there's some kind of ongoing relationship there. If Roman's really building a network of Shield-influenced wrestlers, Knight would be the perfect recruit, establish credibility, natural leadership qualities, and the kind of charisma that could help expand the Bloodline's influence beyond just family connections. Then there's Braun Breaker. And this one's even more interesting because of the timing. Actually, speaking of timing, did you know Breaker's been on the main roster for exactly the same amount of time that Roman's been showing those subtle strategic evolution signs? Could be coincidence, but Breaker's been on the main roster for a while now, but his character development has been remarkably similar to how the Shield members evolved their individual personas while maintaining their collective identity. The powerhouse role, the systematic domination of opponents, the way he's been positioned as both a threat and a potential ally to different factions, that's textbook Shield tactical development. And here's what really caught my attention about Breaker. His recent matches have featured interference patterns that mirror classic Shield tactics. Not obvious interference, not family-style backup, but strategic disruptions that accomplish specific objectives while maintaining plausible deniability. The timing, the positioning, the way he uses chaos to his advantage, it's like someone's been teaching him Shield methodology. But the real smoking gun with Breaker, he's been having brief interactions with Solo Sikoa that WWE's been presenting as casual locker room encounters, but the body language and positioning suggest something more significant. If Roman's building a new enforcement network, Breaker would be the perfect addition: young, hungry, naturally intimidating, and eager to prove himself worthy of elite-level storylines. Now, this next one's gonna sound crazy, but hear me out. Kathy Kelly. I know, she's an interviewer, not an in-ring competitor. But think about how the Shield used to control information flow and media narratives. Like, remember how they always seemed to know exactly what questions were going to be asked in backstage interviews? Kelly's been conducting interviews over the past year that have consistently positioned Bloodline members in favorable lights while subtly undermining their opponents through question selection and follow-up tactics. Actually, you know what's interesting? My cousin works in local news, and she always says the most important part of any interview isn't the answers, it's which questions get asked in the first place. More importantly, Kelly's been present for several backstage segments that featured strategic information being revealed at exactly the right moments to influence storyline development. That's not just coincidence. That's someone who's been integrated into strategic planning processes. If Roman's really thinking long-term about empire building, controlling media narratives would be absolutely crucial. But let's talk about the most intriguing possibility, because this one could completely change how we understand current WWE dynamics: Rhea Ripley. Now, I'm not suggesting Ripley would abandon her current position or storylines, but watch how she's been handling multi-faction conflicts over the past few months. The strategic thinking, the way she manages alliances and betrayals, the way she uses intimidation as a tactical tool rather than just a character trait, That's remarkably similar to how Shield members operated. And here's the really interesting part. Ripley's been having brief interactions with Roman at public events that suggest a level of mutual respect that goes beyond typical roster relationships. Actually, you know what's crazy? I was scrolling through Instagram last week, and there was this photo from a charity event where Roman and Ripley were talking in the background, and the body language was interesting. Like, strategic planning interesting. If Roman's building a network that extends beyond just male wrestlers and beyond just his family connections, Ripley would represent the kind of strategic alliance that could expand the Bloodline's influence into women's division storylines. The pattern I'm seeing across all these potential recruits is consistent: established credibility, natural leadership qualities, tactical thinking ability, and most importantly, the kind of patience required for long-term strategic planning rather than immediate gratification. But here's what really convinces me that this isn't just coincidental similarity in wrestling styles. All of these wrestlers have been positioned in recent storylines where they've had opportunities to demonstrate loyalty, strategic thinking, and willingness to sacrifice short-term individual glory for long-term collective advancement. Those aren't just character development moments. Those are audition scenarios. Like, you know how job interviews aren't really about the questions they ask? They're about seeing how you handle pressure and whether you fit the company culture. That's exactly what I think these storyline scenarios have been. If Roman really is building Shield 2, he's not just looking for wrestlers who can follow orders. He's looking for wrestlers who can think strategically, who can adapt to changing circumstances, and who can maintain long-term loyalty while pursuing their own individual success. The potential recruits I've identified all fit that profile perfectly. And that brings us to the most important question. When and how would Roman reveal this expanded network? Because if I'm right about this, we're not just looking at a faction evolution. We're looking at a complete restructuring of WWE's power dynamics that could last for years. All right, so here's where my analysis gets into prediction territory. And I gotta tell you, the timing patterns I've been tracking suggest we're getting close to something major, like really major. The kind of storyline shift that only happens every few years in WWE, and when it does happen, it changes everything for months or even years afterward. Actually, you know what's funny? I was talking to my barber last week. Shout out to Tony's Barbershop if you're ever in Cleveland. And even he was asking me about when Roman's gonna face some real competition. And I'm thinking, dude, you have no idea what's coming. First, let's talk about the cyclical nature of WWE's major storyline reveals. If you study the company's booking patterns over the past decade, big faction changes and power structure shifts almost always happen during specific windows. WrestleMania season is too obvious. That's when they resolve existing storylines, not when they create new power structures. Summer PPV season is usually about establishing momentum for fall storylines. But that period right after SummerSlam, leading into Survivor Series, that's when WWE traditionally introduces the storyline elements that will define the following year. And here's what's really interesting about timing. Roman's been holding the championship for so long that casual fans are starting to get fatigue, right? But instead of just having him lose the title in a traditional way, WWE's been building towards something that would justify extending his dominance even further. The Shield 2 reveal would do exactly that. It would reframe Roman's reign not as an individual achievement that's getting stale, but as the foundation for an even larger storyline that could sustain interest for years. But let me get specific about when I think this is going to happen, because the signs are all there if you know what to look for. Actually, before I get into the predictions, did you notice how WWE's been doing those subtle camera angles during Roman's matches recently? Like, they're showing more of the audience reactions, more backstage areas, more wrestlers watching from different locations. That's setup, people. Royal Rumble 2025 is going to be the setup. Not the reveal itself, but the moment when WWE starts positioning all the pieces for the bigger picture. Watch for moments during that event where potential Shield 2 members demonstrate their loyalty to Roman in subtle ways. Elimination assists, strategic teamwork, positioning that doesn't create obvious storylines but establishes relationships. Then WrestleMania 2025. And this is where I think we get the first real hint of what's coming. Roman's gonna face a challenge that seems too big for just the current Bloodline configuration. Maybe it's a multi-person elimination chamber situation, maybe it's a gauntlet match scenario, or maybe it's interference from multiple factions that requires a response bigger than what we've seen before. That's when the first new Shield 2 member gets revealed, but in a way that looks like spontaneous assistance rather than planned alliance. But the full reveal? That's going to be SummerSlam 2025. And here's why I'm so confident about that timing. SummerSlam's been WWE's traditional changing of the guard event for major storylines. It's when they've historically introduced the storyline elements that will dominate the following year's programming. Plus, it's far enough after WrestleMania to let the initial hints develop into full storylines, but early enough in the year to build toward next year's WrestleMania season. Now, let's talk about how this reveal is going to happen, because the execution is going to be absolutely crucial. WWE's not going to do this with some big backstage reveal or obvious recruitment segment. That would undermine the whole strategy. Instead, they're going to use a crisis moment where the traditional Bloodline structure isn't enough to handle the threat they're facing. Picture this scenario. Roman's in a situation where multiple challengers are attacking the Bloodline simultaneously. Solo's down, the Usos are overwhelmed, Paul Heyman's freaking out, and it looks like Roman's empire is about to crumble. That's when the cavalry arrives. But it's not family members. It's wrestlers who've been positioned throughout the roster as independent operators, suddenly working with perfect coordination to protect Roman and restore order. Actually, you know what this is going to be like? Remember in Avengers Endgame when all the portals started opening and suddenly there were heroes everywhere? Same energy, but for wrestling. And just as satisfying for people who've been paying attention to the setup, the beauty of this approach is that it reframes everything we thought we knew about the past year's storylines. All those independent feuds, all those seemingly unconnected character developments, all those brief interactions that didn't seem to lead anywhere, suddenly they all make sense as part of a larger strategic plan. And here's the psychological impact this is going to have on the audience. Everyone's been waiting for Roman's downfall, right? They've been anticipating the moment when his power structure collapses and someone else takes over. But instead of giving fans that satisfaction, WWE is going to reveal that Roman's power was never as vulnerable as it appeared. In fact, his influence was spreading throughout the entire roster while everyone was focused on family dynamics. But let's get even more specific about the match scenario where I think this happens. It's going to be a situation where Roman's facing multiple championships threats simultaneously, maybe a cash-in attempt combined with interference from other title holders, or a multi-faction attack that threatens not just Roman's title but the entire Bloodline structure. The traditional family backup isn't enough to handle the scope of the threat. That's when wrestlers throughout the arena, some from backstage, some from the crowd, some who appear to be random roster members in the audience, suddenly coordinate to neutralize the threats against Roman. Not just random assistance, but perfectly timed, strategically executed protection that reveals a level of organization that nobody saw coming. Actually, you know what would be really smart? If they had some of the Shield 2 members disguised as security or camera operators during the match. Imagine the reveal when someone you thought was just event staff suddenly starts coordinating tactical responses. The immediate aftermath is going to be crucial too. Instead of celebrating or explaining what just happened, the newly revealed Shield 2 members are going to disappear back into their regular roster positions, leaving everyone wondering if what they just witnessed was real or if they imagined the coordination. That's going to create weeks of speculation and investigation storylines that keep audiences engaged while WWE builds toward the full revelation of how extensive this network really is. And here's the long-term storytelling impact. Once Shield 2 is revealed, every match, every alliance, every betrayal for the past year gets recontextualized. Fans are going to go back and rewatch old segments looking for clues they missed. WWE is going to be able to create reveal content, showing how long this has been in development. The whole storyline becomes self-sustaining because the reveal makes the past more interesting while setting up years of future content. Actually, speaking of content, imagine the YouTube breakdown videos, the social media theories, the podcast discussions. WWE is basically creating their own version of a Marvel Cinematic Universe moment, where everything connects and rewards people who've been paying attention to details. Section 5, the Reigns reign, unstoppable or vulnerable. So here we are at the crucial question, and honestly, this is what's been keeping me up at night thinking about all this. Like, seriously, my sleep schedule is completely messed up because I keep having these what-if thoughts about where this is all heading. Because if I'm right about S.H.I.E.L.D. 2, if Roman really has been building this sophisticated network of influence throughout the roster, then we're looking at either the most brilliant long-term booking strategy in modern WWE history, or we're looking at the setup for the most spectacular downfall ever witnessed in professional wrestling. Let me start with the case for why this makes Roman truly unstoppable, because the strategic advantages are pretty mind-blowing when you really think about them. Traditional faction warfare has always been limited by numbers and loyalty, right? You can only have so many people in your group before it becomes unwieldy, and family-based factions eventually collapse because personal relationships get complicated by professional success and individual ambition. But S.H.I.E.L.D. 2 solves both of those problems. Instead of a traditional faction structure, Roman's created what's essentially a decentralized network. Individual wrestlers who maintain their own storylines, their own character development, their own championship pursuits, but who share a common strategic philosophy and who can coordinate when necessary for mutual benefit. It's like the difference between a traditional army and a modern special operations network. Actually, you know what this reminds me of? I was watching this documentary about how Apple operates. Yeah, I know. Random tangent. But they have this structure where different divisions work independently most of the time, but they can coordinate instantly when there's a big project or threat. That's exactly what Roman's built. The numbers advantage becomes almost limitless. Instead of being restricted to immediate family members or obvious allies, Roman could potentially have influence with wrestlers throughout the entire roster. Mid-card wrestlers who benefit from occasionally supporting main event storylines, tag teams who gain exposure through strategic alliances, even wrestlers in different divisions who appreciate the career advancement that comes from being part of successful long-term storylines. And here's the really scary part about the loyalty structure. Because these aren't blood relatives or obvious faction members, their loyalty isn't based on personal relationships that can get complicated. It's based on professional mutual benefit, which is actually much more stable over time. Everyone involved gets career advancement from being part of successful storylines, so everyone has incentive to maintain the network rather than trying to break it up for individual gain. But let's talk about the strategic flexibility this creates, because this is where Roman's evolution beyond traditional faction leadership becomes really apparent. With a decentralized network, he can respond to threats from multiple angles simultaneously. Challenger targeting his championship, network members can create distractions and complications throughout the card. Faction trying to overwhelm the Bloodline, network members can even the odds without appearing to be obviously connected. Storyline requiring fresh matchups and feuds, network members can be repositioned to create new dynamics without breaking established character development. Actually, you know what's crazy? If this network is as extensive as I think it is, Roman could basically control the entire flow of WWE programming without anyone realizing it. Like, imagine having influence over who gets pushed, who gets buried, which storylines develop, which feuds get priority. That's not just championship dominance, that's creative control. The intelligence gathering advantages are massive too. Instead of just knowing what's happening with immediate rivals and allies, Roman would have insights into storylines throughout the entire roster. Advanced warning about surprise challengers, insider information about other factions' strategic planning, even influence over how storylines develop before they directly impact his own position. But here's where the vulnerability analysis gets really interesting. Because the same factors that make S.H.I.E.L.D. 2 potentially unstoppable also create some massive risks that could lead to the most spectacular downfall in WWE history. First, the complexity problem. Managing a decentralized network requires constant attention to relationship maintenance, strategic coordination, and long-term planning across multiple storylines simultaneously. That's not just demanding for Roman as a character, that's incredibly demanding for WWE's creative team to execute consistently over time. The more complex the network becomes, the more opportunities there are for storyline contradictions, character inconsistencies, and booking mistakes that could undermine the whole structure. Second, the loyalty sustainability question. Professional mutual benefit works great when everyone's benefiting equally. But what happens when some network members start achieving more success than others? What happens when individual ambition starts conflicting with network coordination requirements? What happens when someone gets offered a better opportunity that requires breaking network loyalty? Actually, speaking of loyalty problems, you know what happened to me last week? I was supposed to meet up with some friends for fantasy football draft, but then my brother offered me tickets to a concert I really wanted to see. Same night, had to choose. That's exactly the kind of conflict Roman's network could face, but on a much larger scale. The original Shield collapsed partly because 3 equally talented wrestlers eventually wanted equal creative attention and championship opportunities. Shield 2 could face the same problem, but on a much larger scale. Instead of managing 3 strong personalities, Roman would be managing potentially dozens of wrestlers with their own career ambitions and creative interests. But here's the really interesting vulnerability that nobody's talking about. The bigger and more successful Shield 2 becomes, the bigger the target it creates for everyone who's not part of the network. If Roman really has been building influence throughout the roster, then everyone who's been excluded from that influence has incentive to work together to bring the whole thing down. Imagine a counter network forming among wrestlers who've been systematically excluded from Shield 2 opportunities. Main event wrestlers who've been kept away from championship opportunities, mid-card wrestlers who've been prevented from advancing, tag teams, and women's division wrestlers who've been marginalized by the focus on Roman's empire building. The mathematical reality is that no matter how large Shield 2 becomes, there will always be more wrestlers outside it than inside it. And that brings us to the most fascinating possibility of all. What if Shield 2's ultimate purpose isn't to make Roman unstoppable, but to create the setup for the most satisfying downfall storyline in WWE history? Think about it from a long-term creative perspective. WWE knows that Roman's character eventually needs to transition away from dominant heel leadership. But how do you create a downfall storyline that's satisfying for an audience that's been waiting years for someone to dethrone him? How do you make his eventual defeat feel earned and meaningful, rather than arbitrary? The answer might be Shield 2 itself. By building Roman's power structure to an almost impossibly sophisticated level, WWE creates the foundation for a rebellion storyline that could sustain audience interest for months. The bigger the empire, the more satisfying its collapse. The more intricate the network, the more dramatic its systematic dismantling. Picture the storyline possibilities. Network members gradually realizing they've been manipulated for Roman's benefit rather than their own advancement. Excluded wrestlers forming alliances to systematically expose and neutralize network influence. Even family members within the traditional bloodline starting to question whether Roman's expanded empire building is worth the increased scrutiny and opposition it's creating. Actually, you know what would be really interesting? If the downfall starts from within the network itself. Like, what if LA Knight or Braun Breaker realizes they're being used and decides to lead the rebellion from the inside? That would be such a satisfying twist. The ultimate question isn't whether Shield 2 makes Roman unstoppable. The ultimate question is whether WWE's building toward the most complex and satisfying downfall storyline in modern wrestling history. And honestly, given everything I've analyzed, given all the patterns I've identified, given the sophisticated storytelling potential this creates, I think that might be exactly what's happening. We might not be witnessing the creation of an unstoppable empire. We might be witnessing the creation of the perfect conditions for the most epic downfall story ever told. So here's what keeps me awake at night, and I want you to think about this too. Everything I've just laid out, the network building, the strategic evolution, the timing patterns, the vulnerability analysis, all of it assumes we're looking at a wrestling storyline. But what if we're not? Actually, you know what's really crazy? I was talking to this guy who works in sports entertainment production. Can't say who, obviously, but he mentioned something about how the lines between storyline and reality are getting more blurred than ever before in WWE. And that got me thinking, what if Roman Reigns has actually figured out how to use WWE's storytelling structure to build real influence within the company itself? What if Shield 2 isn't just a character development for television, but an actual backstage political network that's changing how WWE operates behind the scenes? Think about Paul Heyman's role in all this. The guy's been a behind-the-scenes power broker in wrestling for decades. Solo Sikoa's rapid main roster development, the Usos' sustained championship success. The way Roman's creative input has been increasing. The roster movements that don't make sense unless you consider them as building blocks for something larger. Like, you know how sometimes you read about corporate politics where someone builds influence by helping other people's careers advance, and then suddenly they have this whole network of loyal allies throughout the company? That's exactly what this could be. What if we've been analyzing a fictional storyline when we should have been analyzing a real corporate strategy? And if that's the case, then the question isn't whether Shield 2 makes Roman Reigns' character unstoppable. The question is whether it makes Roman Reigns, the actual person, unstoppable within WWE's power structure itself. Actually, you know what's really wild to think about? If Roman's been building real backstage influence while we've all been focused on his TV character, then he might already have more power than even Vince McMahon had in his later years. Because Vince ruled through ownership and traditional authority, but Roman would be ruling through voluntary loyalty and mutual benefit. But here's the thing, and this is where everything I've been talking about connects to something absolutely insane that just happened. While I've been analyzing Roman's Shield 2 strategy, Triple H just dropped a bombshell that changes everything we thought we knew about the future of WWE. I'm talking about Dean Ambrose's return. Yeah, you heard that right. And Roman's reaction? Let's just say the tribal chief looked anything but tribal when he got that news. Look, everything we've discussed about Shield 2, about Roman's master plan, about his potential vulnerabilities, it all becomes secondary when you consider what Ambrose coming back could mean for the entire power structure Roman's been building. Because here's the thing about the original Shield. It worked because of the dynamic between all three members. Roman learned strategy from Seth, he learned psychological warfare from Dean, but Dean was always the wild card that Roman couldn't fully control or predict. And if Dean's coming back, especially with the kind of real-world influence and creative freedom he's gained during his time away from WWE, that could be the one variable Roman didn't plan for in his Shield 2 blueprint. The one person who knows his strategic thinking better than anyone, but who also has zero loyalty to the empire Roman's built. If you want to see the full breakdown of Triple H's announcement, Roman's reaction, and what this means for the war that's about to break out in WWE, you need to check out my next video. Shield reunited? Triple H announces Dean Ambrose's WWE return reigns stunned before war. Because trust me, after everything we've discussed about Roman's master plan, Dean Ambrose's return isn't just a nostalgic reunion. It's the potential catalyst for the most explosive storyline in WWE history. And Roman knows it.